Before COVID in Mexico, we had quite a journey in terms of distance education. We knew a bit about how to make it happen. And some of us, we thought that we were not necessarily ready, but not in such a bad place to deal with this. In practice, it was tough. It was very, very, very tough. And before I tell you more about this, I'd like you to think about the challenges that your educational context faced during COVID-19. What was problematic? What were the struggles? So think about it for a second, and I'll tell you about what was happening in Mexico. So, we had quite some previous initiatives that relate to distance education. We'd had distance education thanks to printed magazines. We'd used courses via mail and the telesecundarias, which are TV schools. We'd had some initiatives to foster online learning, but there were things. In general, around the world, online learning was the go-to solution for what we needed to do during the pandemic. Many courses, face-to-face courses, had to become online courses during the pandemic. And fair enough, but we have some requirements for online learning to work. And here I'm talking about the basics. Like, before you think about learning design and other more advanced things, no, let's think about the basics. What do you need for online learning to work? You need devices, you need internet, you need some digital literacy, you need something else. What? You need infrastructure. You need a basic infrastructure. You need, buildings, electricity. So what percentage of Mexican schools do you think have a basic infrastructure? And we're talking about electricity, water, toilets. So think about it for a second, and I'll tell you the answer. So in 2020-2021, about 62.8% of primary and secondary schools in Mexico had electricity, water, and toilets. This is not a lot. And what's scary about this is that these are official government statistics. So usually governments try to put themselves in the best possible light, and this is rather bad. So you can see in the map how, depending on the state, is the percentage of schools with this basic infrastructure. So in the north, you'll see that there's the most infrastructure. So here you have Baja California with 92%, Baja California Sur with 79%, here we have a 73%, 70%, 78%, 76%. And the further south you go, you'll start seeing things like this. 35% of schools have electricity, water, and toilets. This is bad. This means that over 60% of schools in Guerrero do not have this basic infrastructure. Or look here, Oaxaca. Only 27, almost 28% of schools have this infrastructure. Chiapas, 27%. This is very, very tough. So if we don't have electricity, water, and toilets, how ready are we to have online learning? So this is for primary and secondary schools. This is for A-level schools. The stats are roughly the same. Actually, the national average is the same, 62.8%. And here you see some things that are a bit better. So Oaxaca has 59.6, almost 60% of A-level schools with basic infrastructure. Guerrero is at 39.3%. The darker the state, the fewer schools with this infrastructure. So this is not good. Another question for you. So knowing that, what percentage of Mexican schools do you think have a computer that can be used for teaching or learning? So now that you know our stats in terms of super basic infrastructure, what do you think about computers? I'll tell you the answer. So the latest stats we have are from 2019, sorry. So at the time, only 54.3% of primary and secondary schools had a computer that could be used for teaching or learning. Again, that is not a lot, especially if you're thinking about schools being ready for online learning. So again, you can see that the north tends to have better numbers than the south. Here you have Oaxaca with only 22% of schools having a computer. Chiapas only 24%, Tabasco 33%, Veracruz 38%, but then in the north here you have 79% in Baja California, Nuevo León 54%, also not great. In terms of, I thought I had the info for A-level schools, apparently I don't. So next question for you. What percentage of Mexican schools do you think have internet access? So now you know about basic infrastructure. Now you know about computers that can be used for teaching and learning. What about internet access? The latest information we have is from 2019-2020, and the national average for primary and secondary schools with internet access was 37.3%. Again, not a lot. And we see the same pattern-ish. We see Oaxaca and Chiapas in the south with the least internet access. This has to do a lot with the region. They have a geographical terrain that makes communities be more isolated, more rural. But yeah, we still have things like here, Durango, 24% of internet access. That's not a lot. And knowing that, tell me, what percentage of Mexican households do you think had internet in 2020? Because, well, during COVID, kids and students didn't go to school. They had to stay at home to learn online when possible. So how many of those homes had internet, do you think? Well, actually, this was not too bad compared to the statistics I just showed you. So in 2020, 60.6% of households in Mexico had internet access. That's not too bad. And it's been growing. The prevalence of internet in the country has been consistently growing through time. So we had 39% of households in 2015. Then we moved to 47%, 50, 52, 56, 60. Something to consider is that these statistics don't tell us about the quality of that internet. So sometimes households had internet, but when you had more than one person trying to connect to a video conference, it just didn't work. At the time, 2020, 72% of the population in Mexico was an internet user. So again, that's not too bad. However, let's have a point of reference. What percentage of British households do you think had internet in 2020? %. So now that's a lot. And actually 100% of households with children had internet in 2020. So compared to that, Mexico was not ready at all to use online learning as a distance education strategy during the COVID-19 pandemic. So was technology the big savior, as everyone was saying? Maybe in some contexts, but in Mexico, not really. No, we didn't have the right infrastructure for it. So what did the government do? We started a strategy that was called Aprende en Casa, which means learn from home. This was for primary and secondary students. And this was a multi-channel strategy. So basically, educational resources were shared via the internet, television, radio, and textbooks. Depending on the school and on the community and on the teachers, is exactly what happened. Sometimes teachers could just teach online with a video conference. Sometimes they had to rely on television programs or radio shows. And sometimes they had to physically share textbooks with students. This strategy has an online site, and it's still being used. It has over 639 million views from 150 countries, which means that other people are benefiting from this, which is useful. So a bit of what we learned about distance education during the COVID-19 pandemic is that we had a lot of content-based learning because that was practical, like the practical option. We had emergency remote teaching as opposed to proper online learning. Not sure if you're familiar with the concept of emergency remote teaching, but it basically refers to a temporary shift in the educational mode in order to address a crisis situation. So it's not meant to replace proper online learning, and by proper I mean online learning where there's a well-thought design that uses good teaching practice, online teaching practice. So no, emergency remote teaching is just something that you have to do on the go quickly because you're just trying to ensure continued access to education. So it's not proper online learning, but it can be online. We learned during the COVID pandemic that we had very poor digital literacy, and this was a big issue. And even though we knew this, it was more evident that we had really poor infrastructure. So we struggled a lot to respond to the crisis. If you're interested in this topic, I did publish a paper related to this. It's called The Forgotten Ones, How Rural Teachers in Mexico Are Facing the COVID-19 Pandemic. I wrote it with my colleagues Alejandro Armelini from the University of Portsmouth and John Traxler from the University of Wolverhampton. So feel free to have a read. It's open. And it's about what happened with rural teachers because it was tough. So some things we saw that were not too bad. And before the crisis, in Mexico, we had the General Law of Education, which established modalities and options for education. So the educational modalities available were schooled, non-schooled, and blended. And the options were open education and distance education. And after the COVID pandemic, online education was legally recognized as an educational option because before this, it was not in the law. It could be it could be open, it could be distance, but not online. Like, it just was not in the law, and now it is. So there you go.